It's really important to understand the changes of the Blair government don't come out of nowhere. Changes on that scale don't. And again, I think you can approach it in different ways. I will be inclined to go back to the thing that everybody gets very excited about now, RUBIS, the rules-based international system. That's to say, the settlement of 1945. The settlement of 1945, I think, is the origin of most of what's gone wrong. Now, I know this again is very unfashionable to say. The general view is, the settlement of the treaties of Versailles was, in other words, the First World War and the League of Nations was terrible. And what happens in 1945, the Nuremberg trials, the setting up of the United Nations International Declaration of Universal Human Rights was a good thing. I think it's proved to be, if anything, even more catastrophic than the settlement of Versailles. Let me try to explain. It goes back to, we've talked a little bit about America and the extraordinary, the world's only successful revolution, the constitutional settlement in the United States. Now, you can approach the American constitutional settlement and indeed the whole nature of the American Revolution in two completely different ways. If you actually look at the Constitution itself and even the Bill of Rights, what strikes you is how unbelievably unadventurous they are. That what they do is, as I said, you get a very, very lightly edited version of the English Constitution of the 18th century, and with only one really fundamental change. Obviously, you introduce elements of election, but remember, they are profoundly aware. This is something traditionally we think of America as the great triumph of democracy. The founding fathers knew democracy was the most risky form of government. They are absolutely aware of this because what the 18th century had done, the work of the French abbé, they'd accumulated lengthy studies of all the different forms of government, the classical ones, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and all the rest of it. And so they knew about the attempts at creating democracies in particularly Italian city-states, the ancient Greek world. They know all about that stuff. They know how fragile democracy is. And what they do, of course, and we forget this, they build a whole series of barriers in the American Constitution to simple democracy. The original idea was that the Electoral College, which nominates the president. Remember, the original idea was that it would actually debate, that the states would have elected delegates to this thing, and they would debate. It never actually happened, but it was intended to be a process of secondary election. And then again, and I think it only happens in the course of the First World War, with another constitutional amendment. The original Senate was not result of election. It was the two representatives were nominated by each state legislature. So it was designed to be a series of highly indirect forms of election. Okay, but but again, even putting that in, yes, there is a much stronger democratic element than there was in the English Constitution. There was also something else that was completely foreign to the English Constitution, which was the idea of separation of powers. Now, this idea of separation of powers, which comes from the work of, he's always called great, I think he's a terrible thinker, Montesquieu. Montesquieu's work introduces this preposterous idea of the separation of powers. He spends a bit of time in England. He speaks no English. He spends all his time mingling with a group of high radical francophone noblemen, led particularly by Viscount Bolingbroke. And the idea of the separation of powers is a heresy. In other words, the idea that you shouldn't have a combination of judicial, of legislative, and of executive authority in the same body. Of course, Parliament is the fusion of all of those three things. How could you have a separation of powers in England when the chief of the executive, remember, there are two monarchs in England. in theory, the monarch is the executive, but the real executive is the secondary monarch, the equivalent of the Japanese shogun, the prime minister. But he sits in parliament. He sits usually in the House of Commons. He depends for his power on command, in other words, in the legislative. His power depends on controlling the legislative. The only reason that the English Parliament survived was that there was no separation of powers. And of course, finally, it also was the supreme judicial authority because it is the final determinant of law. All of that. But the American Constitution introduces this very dangerous notion of the separation of powers, which is one of the reasons that American government functioned generally so very, very badly, which it did for a large period. And the way, as it were, that you've stopped it functioning badly is by effectively turning it into a quasi-monarchy, which you've done by the enormous multiplication of the power of the federal government, in particularly the post-Roosevelt period, but again also the first Roosevelt, Teddy, in the period of the First World War. But the American, but okay, if you look at all of that, if you actually look at the Constitution, you look at the Bill of Rights, you are in most ways struck by how conservative they are. On the other hand, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you're struck by how at least radical its opening statement is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born free and equal. First of all, it's not a truth and it's not self-evident. In fact, it's the most absolute lie you could possibly think of, for the simple reason, of course, that, think of how are you born? As the great St. Augustine said, and I will translate accurately, you're born midst piss and shit. You are an absolutely dependent creature. You exercise no independent will of your own apart to bawl for food for about 2.5 years, right? That's what you are. You're a creature of circumstance. So in other words, what you get in the Declaration of Independence, you get a doctrine of an Enlightenment doctrine of fundamental human rights. And it is the great English practical philosopher, criminologist, and whatever, founder of University College, Jeremy Bentham, who describes doctrines of universal human rights accurately. Nonsense on stilts. If you think about it, how can there be universal human rights? Are there universal human rights now? Where are universal human rights? In China, in Africa, in most of South America, in Southeast Asia, Africa. They do not exist. They're a mere intellectual construct, and I think they are a mistake. But what is very striking is that even though there's this thing called the Bill of Rights in America, the idea of right is very, very little prominent in American politics or jurisprudence until Roosevelt, until the New Deal in the 1930s. And it's at that point that you start to multiply this strange notion of things like the right to work. What? Right to education. In other words, you start to shift from the simple notion of legally entrenched rights like property, freedom of speech, equality under the law, into this extraordinary patchwork of things which seeks to entrench by extra political means what should be the results of the political process. And this is enormously expanded by a simple law of necessity. Why does the Declaration of Independence cite these fanciful, fictional doctrines? It does it because it wants to justify rebellion. It does it because it wants to justify a breach with Britain, with what was in fact an extraordinarily benign colonial regime. It needs to find some external way of doing it. Why does the doctrine of rights take off in the way that it does, and universal rights and doctrines of international law and so on? Why do they take off in the way they do at the end of the Second World War? Because you need, I think, fundamentally to justify the Nuremberg trials, because you need to justify how Nazi Germany was a constitution, horrible, but it was a constitutionally legitimate state. You have to find some ground, some intellectual ground, by which you can claim that what goes on at Nuremberg is simply not. And of course, some of the Nazis are very intelligent. They immediately point out that this is just the justice of the victors. This is simply what you, because you've won, can do to us because we've lost. And what you try to do instead is to come up with a higher pattern of virtue, a higher pattern, as it were, justifies what's being done. The obvious thing to do is to develop this doctrine of right and some kind of universal natural law, which even the law of sovereign states must supposedly bow before. And this doctrine is then extraordinarily developed through the agencies of the United Nations. And I would also argue it is extraordinarily perverted. And it's really important we understand the perversion of it. All the limitations on freedom of speech, for example, which are adduced by radicals on the left, the whole process of cancellation is grounded in the various is grounded in the convention, the debates that turn the convention, the Universal Convention on Human Rights, into the actual treaty, which in theory makes it binding. Why? If you think about it, if you look at the idea of rights as they were in the original Bill of Rights, as they are in English law, those rights are essentially there to protect the individual against the state. What happens is, particularly under the influence of the Soviets, and remember the damnable thing that happens with the United Nations settlement of 45 is the veto that's given to the Soviet Union, and then later on, of course, to China when it too becomes communist, and this perverts the entire system. And what the communist states do from a very early point is to recognize that you can actually invert the doctrine of rights. You can invert the doctrine of human rights, and you do it in the cleverest way. You do it by claiming to protect minorities. You say that the essential purpose of rights is to protect minorities against majorities, which again, of course, fits in beautifully with the narrative of the wickedness of I don't deny it, the hideous wickedness of the Nazi state, the treatment of the Jews and so on. And what you do is you turn this into but then, of course, how do you protect, in practice, the rights of minorities against majorities? You do it by broadening the power of the state. And the whole way there's a remarkable series of articles in a book by a man called who extraordinarily is Danish, has written this remarkable book showing how the Soviets and their Soviet satellites pervert the processes of the United Nations committees, which wonderfully record their debates in the most minute detail, so you can actually see it, and you can see how this argument that freedom of speech must be limited to protect minority rights, the whole business of hate speech and whatever, is all invented by the operations of the Soviets and their satellites in the 60s and the 70s. It's completely extraordinary. But it's true. What happens then is that this doctrine, this idea of right, then becomes very much part of the settlement, the 45 settlement. And of course, I've been talking about it now at the level of the international level, of the world level of the United Nations, of the Universal Declaration. But of course, what you get at the same time is the European version of it, which is the European Convention on Human Rights, written, as we're constantly told, by an English Attorney General. But of course, you've got to remember what it is intended to be. It was never intended to be a body of law. Ever intended to be a body of law. It was a kind of shopping list of what states shouldn't and shouldn't do. I mean, if you actually look at the whole business of freedom of speech, you can see what exactly the problem is. It said that there should be, in principle, freedom of speech, but it should be subject to considerations of public decency, public order, public health, whatever. In other words, if you turn that, and which is perfectly reasonable if you're dealing with states, in other words, the former states that had been under the heel of Nazi Germany itself. If you're dealing with states which had had no such tradition, this is a sensible way of going about constructing a body of law on freedom of speech. But of course, if it becomes a law in itself, because it's so complex, because there are so many exceptions, because there are so many conditions, it effectively becomes a coach and horse for a judge or a court to impose its own views in very, very sharp contradistinction to the tradition of English law, which was one that was as explicit and precise and as limited as possible, and therefore limited judicial discretion.